Well, most of you asked for this, so here it is, my 6-year anniversary with the OG Grom. That's right, so we got the laptop here because we're gonna get nerdy with it. Forgot my neighbors were doing construction upstairs, and they're working on the floor, so it's even closer. Yay. Let's try that again. It's very quiet now. Hopefully, it will stay that way. What I was saying is that I have the laptop here because I want to go over all of my data. I'm a mathematician by trade, so naturally everything is in the form of a number, graph, or chart. I'll go over all of that in this video, as well as kind of dispense some advice, I think, with my 6-year ownership for those of you that have Groms or are interested in a Grom. What kind of maintenance-related items, things that I like, that I don't like, my recommended modifications, or things that maybe I regret. We'll cover all of that, but first, a little bit of backstory on my Grom experience. I covered most of this in my 5-year review, so I'm just going to hit the highlights here. But basically, as you would expect with a 6-year review, I bought this 6 years ago, July 2016. I picked it up brand new, locally here at a dealer, and I paid $3,300 out the door for it. The reason I got into the Grom was that I was working downtown and only had a pickup, for street use at least. I had dirt bikes, but was looking for something kind of small and as a city runabout as a commuter. And before that, I actually did get a scooter like 6 months or a year before, I don't remember. It was a Honda Elite. It was very old, very trash. I paid almost nothing for it, but it was kind of like a test mule to see if I liked it, if I could get used to it, and if I wanted to move forward with getting something a little bit nicer and something a little bit newer. I was looking at scooters and saw someone ride by in a Grom. It was in 2015 or early 2016 when this happened, so Groms were pretty much brand new on the scene at that time. So I looked at it and I thought, that's not something I've ever seen before. So I had to do some internet searching and some Googling to find the actual name of the thing, hondagrom. And the second I found out what it was and saw some videos on it, saw some articles on it, I knew this was the bike I had to get. And 6 years later and 21,000 miles later, it's still in my possession, and I still love this thing. But now that we got all that stuff out of the way, let's get into this review, the 6-year review. So basically the question is, what happened from year 5 to year 6? And the short answer is not much. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, this bike is old. I've had it for a long time, and with 5 years going into 6 years, there's really not that much I want to add to it or to do in addition, other than just kind of regular maintenance as things come up. Second reason is I got the Benelli, and then most recently the CRF 450, and so that took up a lot of my time and energy and modifications. Naturally, because all the attention was going to those two bikes, Grom was taking a back seat and just kind of sat in the background. But that's not to say I didn't do absolutely anything. One of the immediate things that I did right after my 5-year review was replace the clutch. It was in desperate need of replacement, so I replaced all of the clutch plates there, as well as upgrading just a little bit. I went from 50% stiffer springs with man in the box, and I also went with a 6-bolt pattern clutch basket and clutch plate. So I've had that upgraded clutch in there for about a year now, and even though I haven't put that many miles on it, it has been working flawlessly. In addition to that, I had some maintenance related items that actually turned into replacements. So most recently, a couple of weeks ago actually, I was going to lube up the cables, the throttle cables and the clutch cables, and found that one of the throttle cables was frayed pretty badly and bent, so I needed to replace those. 2 throttle cables and 1 clutch cable, and I actually have a video coming out on that in a couple of weeks. And one other thing that I plan on doing, which I haven't done yet, but I have all the parts, they're right behind the camera there out of frame, which is the rear sets. For the longest time, I've had a bent rear set on the brake side as a result of this bike being run over. That's another story for another time, but I wanted to replace that with OEM. However, in this case, I'm actually going to do it a little bit of a twist in that I'm replacing it with Monkey OEM rear sets rather than Grom OEM rear sets. But yeah, that's it. It really hasn't been that exciting for the Grom this year. And again, as I said earlier, that's the nature of a long-term ownership with a bike. It's been with me for 6 years, and so the majority of the stuff that I wanted to do with it has already been done. And it kind of follows, like, I call it a mod curve, and we'll actually kind of see this a little bit later on, but basically my theory, and with most builds in general, is that when you initially get the bike, it ramps up and there's a lot of things to do right away because you just want to throw everything at that. But then over time, You do all that, and then there's not that much left to do, so it kind of tapers off, plateaus, and so let's just get into that right now. So as I said, I have my laptop here in front of me, and what I'm going to do is show you my master spreadsheet. I am a huge nerd when it comes to this stuff. I track every single dollar, literally every single dollar that puts this on the road legally is in this spreadsheet. So we're going to go over it, just hit the highlights because there's quite a lot of stuff in here, and I don't want to bore you with all the details. So what I'll do is I will flip the screen, so you're seeing what I'm seeing on the laptop here, and I actually have this as a Google Drive, and it will be available if you really want to look at the details. It's down in the description below, as well as the links to the 5-year review and the total cost video that I did about a year ago that I referenced this data sheet. What you can see here is a couple of tabs. Number 1 is the parts list. This literally has everything from day 1. July 16th, 2016, description Grom, that was the first thing. Cost $3,300, that's what I paid out the door. Don't you remember when things were reasonably priced? And then beyond that, I have pretty much every single item that I've gotten since then to today. Now, I'm not obviously gonna go over every single thing line by line. I'll let you do that if you wanna take a look. One of the other things that I have on this tab is my mod curve. Basically, this is the visual representation of that graph that I was talking about, that pattern of modifications, that things ramp up pretty early on and then start to taper. But as you can see in my graph, there are a couple of moments where it peaks and then plateaus and then peaks and plateaus. So initially, as you can tell, pretty much almost immediately over the past, the first 3 months of my ownership, I went up to $1,200 pretty quickly. In that, at least some of the bigger items were things like the fender eliminator. I basically bought that with the bike from the dealer, and a couple of other things like an intake, exhaust, and I also did a Katako clutch cover. So all of that plus a bunch more really added up, and so I pretty much just threw a lot of stuff into that from the get-go. From then on, it basically stayed the same. Like all through 2017, I didn't really spend that much money on it. I was just running it. Then you can see here in March of 2018, it did ramp up a little bit. So what I did there was the suspension. So that, again, as I said, it just kind of tapered off for basically 2 years, and I didn't really do that much to it besides probably regular maintenance. Maybe I threw in a thing or two there, but then it comes to May of 2020. So I will call May of 2020 the stimulus check extravaganza month. I really threw a lot of money at this bike at that time because I wanted to freshen things up. At that time, I had it for 4 years at that point, and so a lot of the original stuff that I put on it in the first few months were starting to get worn out. And in addition to that, I also wanted to give it some performance finally, besides the intake and the exhaust that I already had on it. And I also wanted to get some more performance in terms of rolling resistance. For some reason, I had in my head that I needed to lessen the rolling resistance on this bike. This is where I almost pulled the trigger on BST carbon wheels, which I'm really glad I didn't, because now if you look at the prices, they're $2,000 a set. $2,000. So those items plus a few more, it really ramped up, as you can tell, over 2 months. That's quite a jump right there. And after that, it actually ramped up kind of at a reasonable rate, not really plateauing, but not really a cliff either. I think that was as a result of just kind of this channel. I kind of spaced it out as well. There weren't huge bursts like I had over the last, few 4 or 5 years of ownership. After the clutch replacement, I really didn't do that much to it, and so this last year has been basically flat. But yeah, that's basically what this mod curve looks like, but there are other costs associated with this that I do track. So the next tab here is gas. So here I track my total miles and total cost of gas. I use an app called Fuely. Total to this day, just under $700. I think that's pretty awesome considering that this thing has almost gone 21,000 miles. Not bad. Then insurance. This is a little bit difficult to track because I do have a multi-policy discount, and during the lifetime of this bike, I've had a lot of other bikes come and go that were under that policy. So this isn't an exact number, but I kind of averaged it over whatever number of bikes I happen to have at the time. Finally, registration. Thank you, California. Every year I have to pay to keep this thing on the road legally with a tag, obviously, and with that, it's about $135 a year, which is actually pretty high considering that it's almost the same as my car. But it is what it is, so I guess all I can do is just hope that it stays the same for future years. And finally, we come to the total. So this sums up basically every single tab that I just went over and puts it into a total cost. So right here we can see the breakout and that the total as of today is $11,924.94. Seems like a lot, but I also want to average this. I take into account the total mileage and I divide that by the total cost and gives me a cost per mile. So with 21,000 miles or just under, I have about 57 cents per mile, and that's all in. So I look at this cost per mile calculation each and every year, and as you can see, I have a graph right here which tracks that. It's basically the inverse of the mod curve, where with cost per mile, the more miles you put on it, it's spread over a larger number, and so that number is going to go down because I'm putting much more mileage on the bike without putting as much additional money into it. Although, you know, that's negligible. I did put a lot of money into it, let's be honest. Okay, nerd time over, I promise. Now let's kind of get into some overview here. First, I'll go over the maintenance items, some of the failures. And actually, I'm happy to say that there aren't that many. Number one is the clutch collar. Now, this is where the squeal comes from that some people have noticed, and including myself. In high RPM and fourth gear, you would hear this really nasty squealing sound from the engine until you pulled in the clutch and then it would go away. Easy fix, basically just replace the clutch collar, lube it up, put it back in. It was about $10, that plus a couple of washers. The other failure I had was with the stator. After a while, it just would not charge the battery. I would get this really weird instance where the bike was running, but then things would slowly die off. Some of the electronics, like the lights would just shut off, the dashboard would get really dim and start to flicker, and then eventually just go off, even though the bike was still running. So I ended up just replacing the stator, and that fixed everything. It was not that bad, about 60 bucks. And that's pretty much it. That's all I've had to do with this, with any major failures at least. Other than just regular maintenance, oil changes and stuff like that, it's been flawless. Regrets. Is there anything that I regret doing on this bike? And there actually are a few. This first one I don't regret doing, but I regret the process in which I did it, which is the LED headlight conversion. Initially, I just got some DC rectifier. I forget the name of it. I think it started with the J or G, but it was absolute trash, and I did that with a generic LED headlight conversion kit from probably Cycle Gear, I think, and almost immediately, within weeks, burned through that LED bulb. In fact, I went through 2 sets of that before realizing that that rectifier, or that combination of the rectifier and the LED headlight conversion kit, was just absolute garbage. Might even be the reason why my stator went out too. Since doing that, I found the best solution for this, specifically for the OG Groms, is to simply switch to an SF stator and an SF rectifier. That's all you have to replace, direct OEM. They cost the exact same, so it's not that big of a deal cost-wise, and then you can put in an LED headlight kit and it'll work flawlessly. I have since put one in and I've had no issues. It's been running for probably over a year at this point, and I have not burned out anything. And then the last 2 are just kind of things that I put on an aftermarket that I cheaped out on and I wish I didn't. First one being the handlebars. Almost immediately I went with Tusk mini handlebars. They're super cheap. They were like 20 or 25 bucks at the time, but there's a reason for that, because they're primarily for pit bikes, mini bikes, so the post in which you put the grips, there was not that much room for the rest of the gear, the rest of the switch gear, so things are really cramped on that. And the quality of it, I mean, it got scratched up pretty badly, and just from regular use. I didn't abuse the thing. It was just, you know, basically just anytime the keys came in contact with it. And even bigger than that is the seat. I mentioned this in my Saddleman seat video, but I cheaped out before that and replaced the stock one with something that was like 70 bucks. It was terrible. It was garbage. In fact, the foam in that was probably even stiffer than stock. It was just unrideable at that point. I could not ride for more than like 15, maybe 20 miles before just absolutely having to throw in the towel and say, I'm done, I can't ride this thing anymore. Pulling the trigger on the Saddleman seat was so worth it. Yes, it's like 4 times, 5 times the cost of that, but it was so worth it, and now I can ride all day long and be completely comfortable. I really wish I did that sooner. Finally, I thought it would be interesting to boil everything down, everything that I've done, and if I had to pick only 3 mods that I could do to this in total, what would I do? Number 1 has to be suspension. The suspension in this stock is absolute garbage. Even with me, I'm not that heavy. I could still bottom this thing out on speed bumps. So replacing the front forks, the front springs, and with a replacement shock in the rear, that completely changed the dynamics of this bike. It made it that much more rideable, that much more enjoyable. I know it's pretty costly compared to some other modifications, but trust me, you won't regret it. Next one is actually a pretty cheap one, and I would do this before I do something like exhaust or intake like most people typically do, and that's going to be the 14-tooth sprocket in the front. It gives gives you that much more acceleration off the line, so even in a completely stock configuration, you really feel that difference. And a front sprocket is only like $5, $10, something like that, so it's a real easy, effective mod that really gives you that acceleration. And even though you might be losing a little bit at the top, let's be real, it's a mini moto, you're not getting this thing for top speed. And finally, this is going to be specific to the OG and the SF Groms out there, but I highly recommend a Katako clutch cover or similar clutch cover that deletes the oil spinner. So not only are you making oil changes easier by replacing that oil spinner with just a simple oil filter like pretty much every bike, but you're also getting rid of all the weight of the oil spinner on the engine. So the rotational force on that engine is a lot less, and it, at least in my view, I feel like it makes it just that much more peppy, that much more easier to get up in the RPMs without having to go big bore or anything like that. Highly, highly recommend. So what's next? Well, nothing. As I said, it's plateaued. It's pretty much at that point where I don't really want to do that much to it. I will have to put on the rear sets. I do still have that project, so that's upcoming. However, I do have a small, inkling that I really kind of have been toying with the idea of making the DHM Stage 2 that I have in here a DHM Stage 3, meaning I want to put a high comp piston in this. And I know, I just replaced the piston like less than 1,000 miles ago. I think a high comp piston would actually be a happy middle while keeping the stock bore, but also giving me enough, some extra horsepower, some extra torque, whatever it gives. Maybe I should leave it up to the comments. Talk me into it or talk me out of it. But other than that, that's like my only inkling of a wild hair, honestly. I don't see myself putting anything else major into it. But that's it for now. 6 years in the books. On to another 6, or 10, or 15, or 25. Let's just keep it going. Thanks for watching.